I want you to imagine that you're sitting in a cafe, enjoying a nice meal, when all of a sudden the sound of gunfire erupts from across the street. What do you do? Do you hide? Do you start looking for the nearest exit? Do you cover your loved ones? Or do you stand up and run towards the sound of gunfire? Well, on the afternoon of April 14th, 1881, that's exactly what El Paso City Marshal Dallas Stoudenmire did. The former Texas Ranger had been across the street eating lunch when the shots rang out. As everyone else was ducking for cover, Dallas bolted towards the fight, six-shooter in both hands. He opened fire as he was running, and seconds later, 4 men lay dead in the dirt. Dallas Stoudenmire had only been marshal for 3 days, and less than a week later, he would kill yet again. To quote historian Leon Metz, Western history has barely noted Stoudenmire's passing or his accomplishments, but for 2 tumultuous years in the early 1880s, he served as nearly the only law north of the Rio Grande and west of Fort Worth. Make no mistake about it, Dallas Stoudenmire was an extremely capable lawman, at least at first. The only problem was he seemed to have an affliction that, left untreated, caused him to turn on the very town that he was hired to protect. Who was Dallas Stoudenmire? What occurred during his early life that transformed him into a killing machine? And what happens when a marshal goes rogue? How do you control a killer who refuses to be tamed? Join me today as we discuss all of this and more, including a connection between Dallas Stoudenmire and NFL legend Peyton Manning. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Dallas Stoudenmire was born on December 11th, 1845 in present-day Bullitt County, Alabama. And as tends to be the case with many Old West figures, there's just not a lot of information regarding Dallas's early life. We do know that his father passed away when he was still a child. His mother remarried, but by 1860 she was widowed yet again, and she and the kids were residing in Pike County. Then 2 years later, when the war between the states broke out, a just 16-year-old Dallas left home to enlist in the Confederate Army. The only problem was he was still technically too young. It wasn't long before his true age was found out and he was sent back home. The dispatch, signed by General Bragg himself, stated, quote, "Private Stoudenmire, being underage, is hereby discharged from the service of the Alabama Cavalry." End of quote. Undaunted, Dallas tried again the following month, and although he was able to re-enlist, he was discharged again in late October of 1863. Finally, the following spring is when Dallas signed on with Company F of the 17th Alabama, and this time he would serve throughout the duration of the conflict. Ended up surrendering at Greensboro with General Joe Johnston and his bunch. Now, legend has it that Dallas had several close calls during the war. By his own admission, he was severely wounded on 4 separate occasions. And years later, an acquaintance would state that he bore the scars of 27 wounds and that his body still held 3 bullets. I'm usually pretty skeptical about such claims, 27 wounds. More often than not, these types of stories are more hyperbole than fact, but I did do a little digging into the 17th Alabama. Turns out they were assigned to the Army of Tennessee right about the same time that Dallas enlisted. They lost 125 men at Shiloh and another 130 at Peachtree Creek. The ranks were further decimated at the Battle of Franklin, when the regiment lost a full 2/3 of his fighting men. As to how many of these battles Dallas Stoudenmire personally participated in, I'm not really sure. But I do think it's safe to say that he witnessed his fair share of combat. And after the war, Dallas headed west, just like many other shiftless young men scarred by the horrors of combat. He initially joined an older brother in Texas before possibly migrating to one of the Confederate colonies down in Mexico. There are stories of him fighting as a mercenary under Emperor Maximilian, but so far as I know, this has not yet been verified. Truth be told, Dallas's life for several years following the war is mostly a big fat mystery. There are even some who think that he traveled quite a bit from Texas to Mexico, back and forth, in search of gold. It's not until the 1870s that things start to clear up a bit. That's when he settled near the town of Columbus, Texas, and took up farming. Leastways he did until January of 1874. That's when he enlisted as a sergeant in Company A of Captain J.R. Waller's Texas Rangers. That's Captain Waller with 2 L's, okay, not Walker. This is the same bunch that went chasing after John Wesley Hardin down in DeWitt County. Matter of fact, when Hardin was wounded in June of '74, It was one of Waller's men who pulled the trigger. According to other sources, Dallas also spent a considerable amount of time in Comanche country. Now keep in mind that was the same year as the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, so the Comanche were most definitely still a force to be reckoned with. Now that said, Dallas would only serve with the Rangers for around 11 months before mustering out and returning to Columbus. And it wasn't long after that when he took part in his first known gunfight. Or I guess I should say his first known gunfight outside of being a soldier, mercenary, and Texas Ranger. Apparently, he and his opponent had been feuding for quite some time before they finally met up at a place known as Bernardo Prairie. Once again, per historian Leon Metz, quote, circling each other warily, they fired an occasional long-range shot from their pistols. None of the balls took effect. All the while, they drew closer until Dallas, being the better marksman, shot his opponent down and watched him die. And yeah, it wasn't long after that Dallas was at a party and things got a little bit out of control. Folks started trading bullets. Not a lot in the way of details regarding this fight, but Stoudenmire was able to shoot and wound several of the aggressors. He too was wounded and even taken prisoner, but he managed to escape. An investigation soon followed, but none ever really came of it. Hell, Dallas would even serve on a jury right there in Colorado County in September of 1876. I normally wouldn't include such a detail, but hopefully you'll find this as entertaining as I did. Apparently, the trial in question saw charges brought against an outhouse for being a quote-unquote nauseating annoyance. I'm not making this up. They literally took a shitter to court. The outhouse even had its own lawyer. No way of knowing what Dallas thought about the trial, but the official verdict, as issued by he and his fellow jurymen, read, quote, we, the jury, find the privy a public nuisance and order the proper authorities to have it cleaned. End of quote. Now, aside from building a reputation as a deadly gunman and helping to indict shithouses, Dallas also enjoyed having a good time. A former neighbor would describe the 6'2" tall Stoudenmire as, quote, a man who laughed a lot, and what he said made others laugh too. All right. And by all accounts, Dallas was also a big fan of sporting gals, racing ponies, and hard liquor. Matter of fact, in the years to come, he'd have some pretty serious issues when it came to drinking. We'll get to that soon enough, but at some point in the late 1870s, he went partners in a sheep ranch up in the Texas Panhandle with his brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Samuel Doc Cummings. Doc and Stoudenmire's sister, Virginia, would end up migrating to El Paso in early 1880. And by later on that spring, Dallas joined him, just in time to throw his name in the hat for town marshal, a job that, up until Dallas's arrival, seemed to be almost cursed. You see, El Paso's first marshal was an old boy by the name of John B. Taze. You may remember him from the Dangerous Dan Tucker episode. Taze has the distinction of being the only Texas Ranger in all of history to surrender his arms. That was back during the Salt War of 1877. And, well, let's just say the former Ranger wouldn't fare much better there in El Paso. He was sworn in on July 26, 1880, and given the boot just 3 months later, mostly on account of not properly disposing of garbage. Story goes that he was using the garbage to fill in potholes. His replacement was a guy named Stevens, who only made it about a month before also getting fired. I'm not sure exactly what he did, but per records, he was removed for neglect and dereliction of duty. Next up was George Campbell. George got his badge on December 1st, 1880, and he would hold the position for what was then an all-time record of a little over 4 months. Now, it's worth noting that back in those days, the job of marshal did not come with a salary, at least not in El Paso. Instead, the marshal drew his wages either from bounties or through levy and fines, i.e. taking money off of prisoners. The only problem was Marshal Campbell was friends with all the people that needed arresting. As a result, the city of El Paso found itself with what Leon Metz described as a reluctant marshal. The only people that Campbell was willing to lock up were drunks and vagrants, and they rarely had much in the way of currency. Campbell eventually tried to talk the city council into giving him a salary, but they refused. So he went ahead and resorted to some good old-fashioned extortion. Gunfire erupted in the streets, windows were broken, signs were torn down, buildings vandalized, and through it all, Marshal Campbell refused to lift a finger. Things finally came to a head early on the morning of January 1st, 1881. An angry mob began roaming the streets and shooting up various homes, including the mayor's house. And according to some, Marshal Campbell was right there with them. The Texas Rangers were called in, and a warrant was issued for Campbell's arrest, but he remained defiant. Ended up getting drunker than Cooter Brown and riding up and down Main Street shooting his pistols in the air. Then, before leaving town, he threatened the life of the mayor. He also scribbled an obscenity on one of the warrants. No word on what he wrote down, but something tells me it ain't nothing you'd want to repeat in front of your mamaw. Now, you may be wondering, why didn't the Texas Rangers arrest Campbell? Well, come to find out, they were all buddies, or at least some of them were. One ranger in particular, T.L. Weldon, just stood there smiling as the marshal went on his little rampage. And when Weldon was eventually fired, he and some other former Texas Rangers threw in with the quote-unquote lawless element, which, as you'll soon learn, included the marshal. In the end, the charges were dropped, but I think it goes without saying that George Campbell was out of a job. Next up was a saloon owner named Ed Copeland, but he resigned after just a few days. With no other options available, the city council turned to the assistant marshal, Bill Johnson. And this time they did agree to pay a salary of $50 a month. Only thing is, nothing really changed. Marshal Johnson was just as bad as Campbell when it came to being friends with criminals, so it was basically just business as usual. Also, Johnson was a pretty severe alcoholic. Spent more time nursing a bottle than he did keeping the peace. So the people of El Paso were once more in search of a competent marshal. And that's when Dallas Stoudenmire strolled into town. To quote Leon Metz, Dallas was not El Paso's first marshal, but he offered his credentials at an opportune time. No qualified individuals were available, and city fathers were agreeing more and more that the path to growth would have to be paved with the bodies of his toughest citizens. The decision reached, the remaining problem was to hire a gunman with no conscience in his trigger finger. End of quote. In other words, they were looking to hire a killer. And Dallas, with his experience during the Civil War, coupled with his time as a ranger and all of his other adventures, definitely fit the bill. He formally accepted the position on April 11th, 1881. And his first official act as marshal was to demand the badge and jail keys from his predecessor, Bill Johnson. When Johnson started hemming and hawing, Dallas just reached out and violently snatched the keys straight out of his hands. Maybe. Some sources take it a step further and claim that Dallas actually lifted Johnson in the air, flipped him upside down, and started shaking him like a cartoon till the keys fell out of his pockets. Whichever way it shook out, pun intended, Dallas did walk away keys in hand, as the embarrassed Johnson reeled in the muck of the thoroughfare. So yeah, I don't know. I think I probably would have handled the situation with a bit more tact. But hey, who am I to judge? And besides, I'm sure Johnson was a professional and he just took it all in stride, right? False, he did not. More on him in just a bit, but something else happened just a few days later that would absolutely cement Dallas's reputation as a deadly shootist. And this is that gunfight that I mentioned during the intro. It all started when a couple of Mexican vaqueros had come north looking for stolen cattle. Only thing is, they never returned. Skip ahead a few days later, and their bodies were found near the ranch of John Hell, about 15 or so miles north of El Paso. Now, by all accounts, John Hell did traffic in stolen cattle, and so did his neighbors, the Manning brothers. Matter of fact, Texas Ranger Captain George Baylor would describe their two adjacent ranches as sort of a base of operations for the rustlers. It was also Hell and the Manning brothers who represented that so-called lawless element that I mentioned earlier. These are the same old boys who the former marshal, George Campbell, refused to arrest. And hell, when Campbell fled the town after threatening the mayor, it was on Hell's ranch where he sought refuge. Even many of the Texas Rangers were friendly with Hell and the Manning brothers. In fact, one of the guys who actually murdered those Mexican cowboys was himself a former Texas Ranger. And just as a quick tangent, I'm from Texas. I've lived in Texas my entire life, and I'm proud to be a Texan. I also think Texas history is fascinating, but it never ceases to amaze me how many of my fellow Texans hold the Rangers up on a pedestal like they are just beyond reproach. And if there's one thing I've learned doing this show is that there were a lot of dirty Texas Rangers. There were a lot of great Texas Rangers as well. Very courageous, law and order type guys. But there were also some very murderous, back-shooting, thieving, just all-around dirty Texas Rangers. It's just like any other job, right? Some of them were good, some of them were bad. And even in El Paso, in that area, around this same time, there were a lot of good Texas Rangers. But there were also a lot of bad Texas Rangers. Just wanted to toss that out there. I will invariably get a comment or an email telling me that I'm full of shit because Texas Rangers never did anything bad. And okay, but, I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree. Now, as far as those two murdered Mexicans, John Hell would later claim that they had attacked first, and that his men were just defending themselves. But not everyone was buying their story, especially their friends. And those friends rode into El Paso on April 14th, 80 deep, heavily armed, and looking for answers. And this may come as a bit of a shock, but race relations there in El Paso back in 1881 really weren't all that great. I know. To quote historian Leon Metz, each party stood nervously, grouped in the street, muttering threats and staying close to their guns. In particular, the Mexicans were upset over the miscarriage of justice, which they felt was about to be perpetrated. End quote. In other words, they knew damn well that the men who had killed their buddies weren't going to be arrested, much less prosecuted. And by the way, I keep quoting Leon Metz because his book on Stoudenmire is excellent. I'll drop a link down below if you're interested. But yeah, on one side you had a large group of very pissed off Mexicans looking for justice. And on the other side you had the former marshal, George Campbell, his cattle rustling buddy, John Hell, and several of their friends. They'd already been drinking for hours when the vaqueros arrived, and they were growing more and more belligerent with each passing moment. And stuck in the middle, trying to mediate the dispute, was a local constable by the name of Gus Crimcow. Eventually, the Mexicans crossed to the other side of the river, thus temporarily avoiding bloodshed. But Crimcow was still left trying to mollify that angry and drunken mob. According to historian Drew Gomber, quote, a good deal of hostility from the Anglo element had been directed at Constable Gus Crimcow, for the simple reason that he spoke Spanish and had been assisting with the interpreting duties. Many citizens were also enraged that the new marshal, Stoudenmire, had not disarmed the Mexicans. And Marshal Stoudenmire did not disarm the Mexicans for a very good reason. He was busy, sitting across the street at his brother-in-law's restaurant, trying to enjoy a nice casual lunch like a gentleman. A turn of events that did not sit well with many of the locals, especially the former marshal, George Campbell. Not only was he talking trash about Dallas, but he was also heaping abuse onto Constable Crimcow. Just hearing Crimcow speaking Spanish seemed to especially anger the drunken Campbell. And when he told the constable that any American that's a friend to the Mexicans ought to be hanged, Crimcow took it as a personal threat. He asked Campbell if he was talking about him, to which the former marshal replied, if the shoe fits. He then snapped his finger in the deputy's face and walked away. Now, I don't know about you, but just thinking about that kind of makes my blood start to boil. As far as I'm concerned, if you snap your fingers in another dude's face, it's tantamount to just outright slapping him in the face. It's that insulting. And yeah, as you can imagine, things only escalated from there. Just as Campbell was heading back to his mule, here comes John Hell running out of one of the saloons, likewise drunk as a skunk. And for whatever reason, he shoved his revolver under Campbell's arm and yelled out that he had the constable covered. Then, using Campbell's body as a shield, Hell opened fire, shooting Crimcow straight in the chest. And that's when our topic du jour, Marshal Dallas Stoudenmire, finally sprang into action. Remember, he was at the restaurant, still trying to get his lunch on when the shots rang out. Per historian Leon Metz, quote, from across the street, Dallas threw open the restaurant door, and pulling his guns, jumped outside. Close behind came his brother-in-law, Doc Cummins, with a shotgun. End quote. And what happened next would unfold so quickly that Doc didn't even have time to put that scattergun into action. Hell, Dallas even started shooting while he was running, which in hindsight may not have been the best choice, as his first round did strike an innocent bystander. Quickly thumbing back the hammer, Dallas fired again, this time striking John Hell in the forehead, killing him instantly. Meanwhile, the wounded Crimcow managed to draw his revolver and shoot George Campbell in the foot. Of course, by that point, Stoudenmire had also turned his attention to Campbell. He squeezed the trigger yet again, and the former marshal fell to the ground, clutching his belly and cursing Dallas for killing him. Indeed, both Campbell and Constable Crimcow would pass away just a few moments later. That innocent bystander also succumbed to his wounds. Stories do vary, but most witnesses seem to agree that the fight lasted no longer than 5 seconds, hence it now being remembered as the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. Dallas Stoudenmire had only been marshal for 3 days, and he had already killed 3 men, one of whom was simply standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And by the way, this little dust-up took place in front of what's now Hotel Paso del Norte, I think. Double check me on that before you book a trip, but as far as I know, that building is still standing to this day. Now, full disclosure, several eyewitnesses, including a pair of Texas Rangers, would claim that Campbell had been trying to surrender when Dallas killed him. There was an investigation, but the coroner's jury found that Marshal Stoudenmire was justified, despite one of his stray rounds killing a non-combatant. Hell, the town alderman even awarded Dallas the gold-headed cane as a way of expressing their gratitude. But still, gold cane or not, George Campbell and John Hell had friends. Friends who didn't much appreciate seeing him shot down like dogs in the middle of the street. And chief among these friends were the aforementioned Manning brothers. Hey, real quick, today's episode is sponsored by Huel. That's Huel. And I'm excited to share this with you because it really is becoming part of my daily routine. Specifically, the Huel Black Edition Ready to Drink, a complete meal in bottle form. You get 35 grams of protein, 27 essential vitamins and minerals, high fiber, low sugar, so pretty much everything your body needs and nothing it doesn't. Honestly, my mornings are pretty insane. I've got a soon-to-be 4-year-old running around acting like a lunatic thinking she can fly, and I got a brand new puppy trying to destroy all my furniture. Needless to say, I don't really have time to fry up eggs and bacon. So instead, I grab a bottle of Huel Black Edition. And you better believe it keeps me full, focused, and feeling good until my next break. And one thing about me is I do enjoy feeling good. Look, Huel has sold over 500 million meals worldwide. That's 500 million. And now it's your turn to give them a try. New customers get 15% off plus a free gift when you use my code WILDWEST at Huel.com/WildWest. That's HUEL.com/WildWest. Minimum $75 purchase. Fuel your day the smart way with all the nutrition you need ready when you are. So give it a shot. Who knows? You might not skip breakfast ever again. This episode is also brought to you by ExpressVPN. Okay, so I'm not sure if you're aware, but Netflix has over 18,000 titles globally. But here in the United States, we only get about 7,000. In other words, that's thousands of movies and shows that you're literally paying for but can't see. And that's why I like today's sponsor, ExpressVPN. It's super simple, okay? Netflix hides content based on where you live, but ExpressVPN lets you change your online location. Just open up the app, type a country like the UK or Japan, refresh Netflix, and boom, the full library is unlocked. Right now, as of this recording, the following movies are available on Netflix in other countries: Shawshank Redemption, The Matrix, Inception, Goodfellas. These are all amazing titles, but you can't watch them if you're living in the United States unless you're using a service like ExpressVPN. Simply put, ExpressVPN is the real deal Holyfield. It works on all your devices, it's blazing fast for streaming, and you have total privacy with encrypted traffic, okay? So nobody needs to know that you're watching Magic Mike for the 13th time. So be smart. Stop paying full price for streaming services and only getting access to a fraction of their content. Get your money's worth at expressvpn.com/wildwest. Don't forget to use my link at expressvpn.com/wildwest to get an extra 4 months free. One more time for the people in the back. That's expressvpn.com/wildwest to get an extra 4 months free. Now, let's get back to the show. Now, the Mannings were originally from Alabama, just like Stoudenmire. The eldest, Felix, was actually studying medicine in France when the war between the states broke out. As such, he rushed home and accepted a commission in the Confederate Army. And just like Dallas, Felix and his brothers would drift down to Mexico following the war and offer their guns to Emperor Maximilian. They'd return stateside after the emperor's death and settle in the town of Belton, Texas. All of them except for Felix, that is. Instead, he went ahead and completed his schooling at the Medical College of Alabama. And upon graduation, he too headed to Texas to set up his own practice. It's there, near Giddings, where he was involved in a pretty gruesome knife fight with a rival doctor. Although both men were horribly wounded, they did survive. And once Doc Manning was able to travel, he joined his brothers up in Belton. They too had shown a willingness to spill blood. When William Manning was killed during a cattle drive, brothers Jim, Frank, and John tracked down his murderer and filled him full of lead. And by 1880, they were all residing near the bustling metropolis of El Paso, where they quickly established what one historian referred to as a cattle-rustling empire. Hell, it was the Mannings, allegedly, who headed south of the border to steal cattle. the same theft that those two vaqueros were investigating when they were murdered. That said, the Mannings also had legitimate business interests. In addition to that ranch and the medical practice, they also had a saloon there in El Paso, as well as a variety theater known as the Coliseum. Jim Manning even ran for mayor at one point. As for his older brother Felix, or Doc Manning, he was described by a local as, quote, probably the most accomplished gentleman in early El Paso. Apparently, he was willing to treat smallpox patients when others wouldn't. He was also one of the few sawbones who cared for the impoverished. As to how involved Doc Manning and his brothers truly were when it came to the illegal activities, I'm not really sure. But I do know they were good friends with John Hale and George Campbell. That much is a fact. To the point that they actually tried to talk Bill Johnson into trying to kill Dallas out of revenge. Remember, Johnson was the drunken marshal who Stoudenmire embarrassed. And per Leon Metz, quote, the more Johnson brooded over his humiliation, the more encouragement he received from the Manning brothers. When the brothers were not appealing to his pride, they were playing on his fears. The Mannings told Johnson that Stoudenmire intended to kill him. In addition to keeping the dupe on edge with their words, the Mannings never allowed Johnson's glass to empty. When the constable drank and babbled and blustered and threatened and even wept, everyone appeared to be sympathetic. The Mannings solemnly nodded their heads and agreed that Marshal Stoudenmire had no right to trample on his self-respect, end quote. And sure enough, just 3 days after the death of Campbell in hell, Johnson went and hid himself behind a large pile of bricks near Jim Manning's saloon. Then, when Marshal Stoudenmire and his brother-in-law, Doc Cummins, came strolling by, Johnson opened fire. Luckily for them, his shot went high, and Dallas and Doc were able to spin around and put no less than 8 bullets into Johnson's body. The only thing is, he weren't the only shooter. They were also receiving fire from unknown parties in the direction of the saloon. And just like before, Dallas didn't hesitate. He charged headfirst at his assailants, once again firing as he ran. A bold maneuver that caused the would-be killers to disperse. The only casualty, other than Johnson of course, was Stoudenmire's foot. I guess a stray round or a ricochet had caught him in the heel. And yeah, talk about a hell of a first week, right? It hadn't even been 7 days since he pinned on the badge, and Dallas had already found himself participating in 2 separate gunfights. He had killed 4 men during that same period, and he himself was wounded. He had also showed the criminal element there in El Paso that he meant business. Dallas may have enjoyed a nice laugh on occasion. He definitely enjoyed a drink of an evening and the company of soiled doves, but he was deadly serious when it came to police in the streets. And make no mistake about it, crime did indeed plummet under Dallas's watch, at least initially. Remember what I said earlier about that El Paso Marshal position being seemingly cursed? I'd love to sit here and tell you that Dallas Stoudenmire spent the next 30 years just dutifully enforcing the law and protecting and serving, but sadly, that's just not the case. Turns out Dallas would grow just as fond of the bottle as his predecessors, Campbell and Johnson, especially after the death of his brother-in-law, Doc Cummins. You see, in early February of 1882, Dallas headed back east to Columbus to get married. And in his absence is when Doc Cummins decided to set things straight with the Manning brothers. Doc had actually been temporarily deputized just before Dallas left town, so I guess he was starting to feel himself. Didn't help matters none that he was also drinking whiskey like it was going out of style. Swore that he was going to clean out those damn Mannings. And sure enough, that's exactly what he attempted to do on February 14th, 1882. The incident in question occurred at the Coliseum Theater. Cummins stepped inside, 3 sheets to the wind, and did his level best to go Jim Manning into a fight. Jim took off his coat, showing that he was unarmed, and told Doc that he didn't want no trouble, and asked him why couldn't they come to a peaceful resolution. Jim even said that he would get down on his knees or pretty much do anything else to settle their dispute without resorting to violence. Doc just sneered and called him a coward. He then turned his attention to one of the bartenders, accusing him of hiding the gun behind the bar. Jim spoke up again and said that he didn't hire bartenders to do his fighting for him. Eventually, they both stepped outside, and Doc grabbed Jim by the collar, threatened to kill him. That's when a passerby approached, which caused Cummins to whirl around. And by the time he turned back, Jim was gone. You know, at this point, Doc should have just cut his losses, gone home, and slept it off, right? Well, instead, he decided to head back inside the Coliseum to continue abusing that bartender. And that's when Jim Manning stepped into the room, this time with a revolver belted around his waist. He told Doc that it was time, and in a flash, they both went for their guns. Cummings managed to get off the first shot, but it passed harmlessly over Jim's head. In turn, the very-sober Jim Manning plugged Doc twice in the torso. According to historian Leon Metz, Cummings, quote, reeled across the room, crashed through the bat-wing doors, collapsed, and died on El Paso Street. As he lay there in the road, he emitted one terrifying groan, shit his pants, and in the street grew silent. End of quote. And yeah, I did just add that part about him shitting his pants. That didn't come from Leon Metz. But if there's one thing I have learned from South Park, is that we all shit ourselves on our way out, okay? So act accordingly. Now, Jim Manning would later say that he stood it as long as he could, but I guess Cummings just pushed him too far. Interestingly enough, when another deputy examined Doc's pistol, it had two empty chambers on opposite sides of the cylinder. Not only that, but the medical examiner said that he suffered from a fractured skull. So I don't know, maybe he landed on his head when he fell down, or maybe the official version that I just shared wasn't exactly how the gunfight happened. But nevertheless, most of the locals did seem to agree that Doc caused his own early demise. Still, though, despite this overwhelming consensus, Dallas Stoudenmire was not a happy camper when he learned of Cummings' death. I mean, you gotta think, in addition to losing a friend, he also lost his most trusted ally. And little did Dallas know it, but he himself would be dead in just 7 months. Once again, per Leon Metz, quote, the feud between the two factions began to blaze after the start of Stoudenmire's administration. First Hell and Campbell had fallen before the Marshal's smoking pistol. Then the Mannings sicked Bill Johnson on Stoudenmire, and Johnson toppled to his death, carrying a volley of bullets in his chest. Now the brothers had evened everything by slaying Doc Cummings, and with Doc gone, there were no others whom Dallas could depend on. He stood all alone to face his enemies. End of quote. Now, I know I touched on Stoudenmire's drinking earlier. By all accounts, he really did enjoy having a good time. But these good times were growing much more frequent, especially after the death of his brother-in-law. That's when Dallas pretty much just dove headfirst into the bottle, and it did not take long before it began affecting nearly every other facet of his life, including his marriage. You see, despite being a newlywed, Dallas was spending even more and more time at the brothels. There were rumors that he was using opium, and what's more, he seemed to always be on the prod. Dallas was not a happy drunk. When he started drinking, he got mean. Wasn't long before he started feuding with the Texas Rangers, who were stationed nearby. And hell, on one occasion, he even picked a fight with a local minister. The Reverend's great sin was preaching a sermon on the Marshal's drinking habits, and when Dallas found out, he unloaded his revolver into the church steeple. Later on, when a lawyer showed up at the jailhouse, Dallas literally drop-kicked him through the door. And if that ain't bad enough, he was just constantly trying to provoke the Manning brothers, even going so far as to set up targets right in front of their saloon and put on shooting expeditions at the exact location where he killed Hell and Campbell, just rubbing their faces in it. As I'm sure you can surmise, the good folks of El Paso weren't all that happy with the drastic decline of their new marshal. They even started calling on the city council to force a resignation. The only problem was the council just didn't have enough of a backbone to get it done. What they did do was pass a city ordinance forbidding public officials from getting drunk, gambling, using profanity, disturbing the peace, exposing themselves indiscreetly, and to not be, quote, seen in the company of a known prostitute, not his wife or some other relative, end quote. I can only assume that Dallas was guilty of all of the above. I don't know about you, but I'd be especially interested to hear the story about him exposing himself. And all of these laws were just blatantly ignored, by the way. Dallas and everybody else just went about their drunken whoremongering unmolested. And since the leading citizens knew they couldn't control Stoudenmire, I guess they figured they could at least mediate peace between him and the Mannings. You know, before they turned the whole damn town into a shooting gallery. And on this front, they were successful, at least on paper. The peace treaty in question read as follows. We, the undersigned parties, having this day settled all differences and unfriendly feelings existing between us, hereby agree that we will hereafter meet and pass each other on friendly terms, and that bygones shall remain bygones, and that we shall never allude in the future to any past animosities that have existed between us. It was signed by Dallas and all of the Manning brothers except for John. Why he didn't sign, I'm not really sure. Maybe he wasn't in town. But like I said, this was a truce just on paper only, okay? Per historian and all-around El Paso expert Leon Metz, quote, "It's important to note that this was not the type of truce following which both parties shook hands and bought a round of drinks. It was merely an agreement to hate on more silent terms. Nothing had really been settled," end quote. And yeah, Dallas certainly didn't clean up his act none. Treaty or no treaty, he just went right on doing as he pleased. At least he did until he got so drunk that he couldn't even report for duty for over a week. And believe it or not, he still didn't lose his job. That particular shoe wouldn't drop until the city council discovered that he'd accepted a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal over in New Mexico. I don't know why that was such a big issue, but yeah, finally, at long last, Dallas Stoudenmire was out of a job. For about 5 minutes. There was another guy hoping to fill the position, old boy by the name of W.W. Mills, but when it came down to a vote, the council, for whatever reason, just went ahead and reinstated Stoudenmire. I say for whatever reason, but it's pretty obvious, to me at least, that they were scared shitless of the man. I think you'll understand more here in just a moment. But according to Leon Metz, however, the city council just chose to reinstate Dallas so he could redeem himself. And yeah, maybe, but unfortunately, Dallas just couldn't seem to rein in his drinking. When he wasn't drinking, he was fine. But you get a little bit of liquor in him and those demons started coming out. Case in point, remember that guy I mentioned a moment ago, W.W. Mills? Well, Stoudenmire didn't much appreciate him trying to take his job as marshal, so he called Mills out. And when Mills said that he was unarmed, Dallas offered him the loan of a revolver, which Mills wisely refused. Things got so bad that Dallas wasn't even pretending to do his job. He made so few arrests that he hadn't pulled a salary in 3 months. Now, things were so bad that he owed the city money. It was his assistant, James B. Gillette, who was pretty much doing all of the official duties. And unlike Dallas, Gillette was exceeding expectations. The final nail in the coffin for Dallas in that marshal's position came in May of 1882 when he tried to run a journalist out of town. The local papers, which were usually pretty critical of one another, all joined forces and demanded that he resign. Even the Manning brothers were putting pressure on the city council to do something. And when the council finally decided to hold a meeting, they did so armed with loaded shotguns. One of the aldermen was so scared that he declined to even attend. The others sat near windows so they could make a quick leap to safety if need be. And these fears were not unfounded. When Dallas arrived, he was extremely inebriated and almost immediately began threatening the councilman. At one point, he even bragged that he could, quote, straddle every goddamn alderman in this council. Things got so heated that the meeting was just dismissed with plans to reconvene the following Monday. You know, I find this entire situation to be very fascinating. They hired a stone-cold killer to keep the peace, and now they're acting astonished that said killer refused to play by the rules. And the craziest part is, the council could have fired Dallas at any moment. They literally held all of the power. But they were just too damn scared. I can't imagine anything like that happening nowadays. You know, a madman given a position of authority, and then using that authority to wreak havoc and mayhem, and the people who actually have the power to stop him just sitting there wringing their hands and failing to do so out of fear. Surely, nothing like that would ever happen in our modern times, right? And don't call me Shirley. Now, to Dallas's credit, once he sobered up on Monday, he did offer an apology. Not only that, but he also agreed to resign. Quote, believing as I do that under the present administration of the city government, my usefulness as city marshal will become materially impaired, and learning that there will be an attempt to reduce the pay of the marshal, already too low, I hereby tender my resignation as city marshal. Before parting company with the officers of the city, which I feel that I have suffered an injustice from certain members of your honorable body, I think it is my duty to, and do hereby apologize for my conduct in the council chamber last Saturday evening, and beg to assure you that I meant no disrespect to your body or the people you represent. P.S. This applies to everyone except for Kyle. Fuck you, dude. I know it was you who stole my lunch out of the fridge last Tuesday. I was looking forward to that Parmesan sub the entire ride into town. It was literally all I could think about, only to find it missing and the crumbs leading straight to your stupid little cubicle. End quote. And yeah, I did add that extra little bit about Kyle and the Parmesan sub, but the rest of it was true, and that was Dallas Stoudenmire's actual resignation. And good on him for putting on his big girl panties and owning up to his behavior. That takes integrity. It also shows that he probably would have been alright if he could just stop drinking. And yeah, the city council accepted this time, and they promptly voted James B. Gillette as the new marshal. Gillette, by the way, was a pretty interesting guy in his own right. Gonna do an episode on him one day in the future. But for now, we're talking about Dallas, and everybody did seem happy with the agreement. Hell, Stoudenmire even offered Gillette his assistance if it was ever needed. In the meantime, Dallas did go ahead and accept a position as Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Western District of Texas, which meant that he continued residing there in El Paso. And his recent good behavior notwithstanding, he still continued causing trouble, at least when he was in town. Hell, in late July, he was even arrested after trying to shoot one of his former assistant marshals. And why did he try to shoot his former assistant? Because he was drunk. That's why. Things seemed to improve a few months later when he made a trip to the hot springs outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico. Not only did he manage to quit drinking temporarily, but he also started exercising and even expressed a desire to reignite peace talks with the Manning brothers. Sadly, this about-face was extremely short-lived. Dallas started drinking again on the train ride home, and by the time he got to El Paso, he was staggering drunk. He spent most of that night at the Acme Saloon, same joint where John Wesley Hardin would meet his demise some 13 years later. After last call, Dallas paid a visit to a brothel, and when his favorite working gal didn't immediately appear, he just stood there in the street screaming out her name. I'm sure his wife really appreciated that. And then, at some point later on that night, he actually walked to the front door of Jim Manning's saloon and started peering inside. He didn't try to enter, he was simply looking through the door. Now, Dallas wouldn't wake up until noon of the following day. And as soon as he got out of bed, he made a beeline straight for the Acme for a little hair of the dog. But that incident at the Manning Saloon the night before did not go unnoticed. And Dallas wasn't in the Acme for more than 5 minutes before a heavily armed Frank Manning stepped inside. When the barkeep said that he'd prefer to avoid trouble there in the saloon, Frank stated that he'd just as soon have it happen here as in the hills or anywhere else. Said that the sooner things were settled, the better it would be for all involved. Dallas didn't take the bait, though. I guess he was still feeling a little shaky. Instead, he just got up and went to a different saloon. He even told the owner of the Acme, J.W. Jones, that he didn't want no trouble, but, quote, "If they are bound to fight, I will fight any of them." He then explained that the only reason he peered into the saloon the night before was because he was looking for a fugitive he had papers on. Nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't trying to pick a fight. He was just looking for a wanted man. Jones passed the information on to the Mannings, and they seemed to be relieved. They said that they, too, wanted to avoid gunplay. More notes of peace and goodwill were passed back and forth until finally they all agreed to meet back up at the Manning Saloon later on that evening. Bury the hatchet once and for all. And things did go well at first. Frank Manning wasn't there just yet when Dallas arrived, so little brother Jim said he'd go fetch him. In the meantime, Dallas stepped to the bar next to Doc Manning and offered to buy him a drink. That's when things started going off the rails. Guess there was just too much damn bitterness, and the two began arguing, with Doc accusing Dallas of not sticking to the terms of their original agreement, a reference to that peace treaty they had all signed months prior. And from there, things just quickly escalated. Jones, the owner of the Acme Saloon that I mentioned earlier, he came inside and actually jumped between the men and tried to separate them. But by that point, they were already going for their guns. Doc Manning managed to clear leather first and put a bullet in Stoudenmire's left arm. The round severed an artery before ricocheting and striking him in the chest. And the pistol that Dallas was in the process of drawing flew from his hand and skidded across the floor. Manning fired again as Dallas staggered backwards, but the bullet contained a weak charge, only served to knock the breath out of him. Stoudenmire was still on his feet and stumbled outside with Doc Manning close behind him. That's when Dallas pulled out his belly gun and shot Doc in the right arm. Manning then dropped his pistol, and the two of them resorted to hand-to-hand combat. That's when Doc's brother Jim rushed up from behind and put a bullet squarely in the back of Stoudenmire's head. By the time Marshal Gillette arrived, Doc Manning had retrieved his pistol and was straddling Dallas's body, just repeatedly smashing his revolver down against his head. Now, both Jim and Doc Manning were arrested, but they were both eventually found not guilty. Worth noting that they did have friends on the jury, so I imagine that helped out their cause quite a bit. As for Stoudenmire, his funeral was held there in El Paso, but his body was shipped back to Columbus for burial at the Alleyton Cemetery. He was 36 years old at the time of his death. By the way, he and his wife Isabel had only been married for a few months, and one has to wonder, especially considering his recent behavior, if she gave a sigh of relief when Dallas was killed. She'd end up remarrying a little over a year later and living all the way until 1921. Now, John Manning would actually go on to become El Paso County Sheriff, but he got seriously wounded while transporting a prisoner to Huntsville. Ended up moving up to Washington State, where, according to some, he committed suicide in May of 1918. Brother Jim would also move to the Pacific Northwest. He'd then migrate south to Los Angeles and finally Arizona, where he began working in the copper and silver mines until his death in 1915. Believe it or not, Frank Manning would go on to replace James B. Gillette as El Paso City Marshal. He was quarrelsome, though, just like Dallas, and he, too, would be forced to resign. He joined his brother Jim over in Arizona, but his brain began to fail him. His family had him committed in 1922, and he passed away in mid-November of 1925. As for Felix Doc Manning, he moved to Arizona as well and opened up a medical practice near the town of Flagstaff. His arm was permanently crippled from the wound he received from Dallas, and he'd often hold it behind his back when he was having his photograph taken. He'd passed the same year as Frank at the age of 87. Now, this next little bit I found very interesting. I'm not making this up, but Doc Manning had a son born in 1889 named Peyton. Yeah, Peyton Manning. And Peyton would go on to have a son in 1929 named Peyton Manning Jr. As far as I know, this is just a coincidence, and they're not related to the NFL Mannings, as far as I know. But I just thought I'd toss that out there. And yeah, that's the story of Dallas Stoudenmire and his short yet prolific career as El Paso City Marshal. Dallas's story, it's a tale of caution, but it's also a tale as old as time, right? This dude had a lot of promise, especially when he first arrived there in El Paso. And if it wasn't for his fondness of alcohol, who knows how he would have turned out. Leon Metz made a great point in his biography on Stoudenmire when he wrote that had it not been for the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight, we probably wouldn't know who Dallas was. He simply would have faded into history as yet another town drunk, or as Metz put it, quote, just another gunman who found himself crossways in the liquor bottle. Metz also goes on to write that a psychiatrist would likely say that Dallas suffered from deep feelings of inferiority. I mean, how else can one explain his bragging, bravado, his shooting at targets that represented victims, his heavy drinking, and his quickness to take offense? Without these shortcomings, he might have lived longer, but he would never have been as interesting or as colorful. And yeah, I tend to agree, but there was just something in Dallas that wouldn't let him be at peace. There's a great quote from the book Godfather by Mario Puzo. I don't think it made it to the movie, but this quote has served me well my entire life, and it goes as follows. There are men in this world who go about demanding to be killed. You must have noticed them. They quarrel in gambling games. They jump out of their automobiles in a rage if someone so much as scratches their fender. They humiliate and bully people whose capabilities they do not know. I have seen a man, a fool, deliberately infuriate a group of dangerous men, and he himself without any resources. These are people who wander through the world shouting, kill me, and there is always somebody ready to oblige them. And yeah, with Dallas, that someone was Doc and Jim Manning. For others, it's a random person they cut off in traffic, or a bullied employee, or a spurned lover. Dallas had an affliction. Maybe it was caused by the war, maybe it was caused by the bottle, or maybe he was born with it. I don't know. But one thing's for certain. There at the end, he was practically begging for it. Now, before we go, I do want to say one last thing. I got a lot of mixed reactions on the recent Young Guns 3 episode. And I get it, okay? Young Guns 1 and 2 are classics. And there is a legitimate concern that a sequel could somehow tarnish the legacy. Also, a lot of people are just fed up with sequels. And on that note, I do agree. I mean, let's be honest, do we really need Happy Gilmore Part 2? And then, of course, there are those who don't really like the idea of Brushy Bill Roberts and his tall tales overshadowing the real-life Billy the Kid, which I also kind of agree with. But what it all comes down to, for me, it's simply nostalgia. That's it. Young Guns 3 is not going to be a documentary, okay? And besides, let's be real, it's not like Guns 1 and 2 were super factual, okay? They had a 50-year-old man portraying a 24-year-old John Tunstall. They showed Billy the Kid killing L.G. Murphy. That never happened. Doc Scurlock never ran away to New York City, he never married an Asian lady, and he was not killed at Stinking Springs. Jane Greathouse from White Oaks was actually Jim Greathouse. That's right, a dude. William Henry French was not a real person. Dave Rudaball was never known as Arkansas Dave, and Pat Garrett never rode as an outlaw with Billy the Kid. I could go on, but like I said, these movies, they're not meant to be documentaries, okay? They're just for entertainment. I'm a big fan of Braveheart, but guess what? Braveheart is probably one of the most historically inaccurate movies ever made. Same goes for Gladiator and The Patriot and pretty much every spaghetti western or John Wayne movie. Matter of fact, I don't think I've ever seen a truly historically accurate western. But, like I said, as far as how I feel about Young Guns 3, it's purely nostalgic. It's nothing more, it's nothing less. The movie might suck, I have no idea. I'm looking forward to it just because Guns 1 and 2 were such a big part of my early life. And if it turns out to be a bad movie, then I'm confident I will somehow survive. Alright, and I think that about does it. Until next time, don't go snapping your fingers in anyone's face, okay? That's just rude. Don't kill anyone during your first week on the job, and whatever you do not accept a position as El Paso City Marshal. If history is any indication, it will not end well. Adios.